Only in America.
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 This week, the challenges of bringing our immigration policies into the 21st century.
I think that there are a lot more people out there that are trying to do the right thing and want to do the right thing than we are necessarily exposed to or presented to on a daily basis. I met some of the greatest, most patriotic, hardest working people in my life doing this work, and I will always be grateful for that. And just because we didn't succeed doesn't mean that we didn't accomplish some things that we should be proud of.
From the National Immigration Forum, I'm Ali Nirani, and this is Only in America. Welcome back. For the past few weeks, we've been taking a step back to ask, how did we get here when it comes to immigration policies? We started this series with a look at the factors that led to the 1924 immigration law that created racial quotas for immigrants. Then we heard about the fight for the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, landmark legislation that opened the door to immigrants from all parts of the world and expanded family-based immigration. We then turned to the 1980s and the challenges and lessons of successfully finding compromise on the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 that legalized approximately 3 million undocumented immigrants. And last week, we delved into the political atmosphere of the 1990s and early 2000s, examining the impact of 9/11 on our understanding of how security, immigration, and enforcement intersect. This week, we're stepping further into the 21st century and looking at the mechanics of more recent attempts at bipartisan immigration reform. What spurred the push for reform in 2007 and 2013? And why, ultimately, did these efforts fall short?
Support for the National Immigration Forum comes from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, supporting innovations in education, democratic engagement, and strengthening international peace and security. And from Humanity United. When humanity is united, we can bring a powerful force for human dignity.
The word refugee is thrown around a lot, but who does it actually refer to? We want to tell you about a new podcast from Virginia Public Media called Resettled. Resettled shares the intimate moments of refugees' lives and explores the policies that shape their future in the United States. From navigating the healthcare system to budgeting for a family with no credit history, hear from resettled refugees not as victims or statistics, but from their experiences firsthand. Listen and subscribe to Resettled wherever you get your podcasts.
My guest this week is Becky Tallent. These days, Becky is the head of U.S. government relations at Dropbox. Previously, she spent the majority of her career on Capitol Hill, including time as chief of staff to former Senator John McCain, as well as advisor to former House Speaker John Boehner. She's also currently the vice chair of the forum's board of directors. As a Republican immigration staffer on Capitol Hill, Becky had a front row seat to the critical but often tenuous negotiations around bipartisan immigration reform. While working for Senator McCain, she played a key role in 2007 proposals for a bipartisan immigration deal. That bill would have provided a path to citizenship for around 11 million undocumented immigrants in the U.S. while increasing border enforcement. Although Congress ultimately did not pass the bill, the effort represented a major step in creating compromise between Republicans and Democrats on immigration. During the next comprehensive legislation push in 2013, Becky was Director of Immigration Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center. But soon, she got the call from the Hill. And before Becky knew it, she was back on the Hill working for then Speaker John Boehner as his key advisor on immigration. Over the course of the next 2 years, a bipartisan bill that paired a path to legal status with ramped-up security measures that was championed by leading Democrats and Republicans alike made its way through the legislative process to ultimately fail to become law. Becky and I talked about what it was like to witness these key immigration moments, what we can learn from them, and why today's Republican lawmakers should champion the opportunity for meaningful immigration reform. In that period in time in 2006 and 7, you've got a couple of factors that I'm really curious to get your perspective on as playing a leadership role within key Republican offices, because you got, the HR 4437, the Sensenbrenner bill. And then coming after that, you have the major immigration rallies of 2006 and going into 2007. How do those two factors help or hurt what Republicans in Congress were trying to do to get to a solution?
Yeah, that's a good question. What was interesting was, again, this was my first experience with a big bill and working in kind of an issue that was in the spotlight, because it was my first time working on a bill really at all. So, that piece of it was a little shocking. And I know that that's not your question, but just for me to say that was something that I didn't really expect. And then, of course, when we start talking about 2013, we know what that kind of evolved into. And I will say that I was constantly surprised by the amount of energy that folks would put into expressing their feelings over something that ultimately really didn't impact them, if I'm going to be blunt. So there's always, and again, this will come out when we talk more about 2013 too, but there's always an interesting dynamic between the House and the Senate, right? And the Senate obviously is built the way that it is and has 6-year terms because the idea is that it's supposed to be a kind of steady hand on the wheel. But having worked in both chambers, I can also say that also means that the Senate thinks that they figure things out and that the House is just kind of herky-jerky and that they should just follow the Senate's lead on a lot of things. The Sensenbrenner bill was a response to what they saw as this proposed big amnesty that's being advocated for in the Senate. And it was kind of a response to saying like, nope, we're not going to go that way. That's just those liberal senators, thinking crazy. And what we need to do is secure our borders. And I don't mean to be flip about that, because there's something to be said for the fact that was the big promise after the 86 amnesty, was that this was going to be a one-time amnesty. And then we were actually going to secure the borders. And I think that it's fair to say that we have not succeeded at that, for a lot of reasons. So I don't want to be dismissive of the idea that people were frustrated over the fact that we are now staring down potentially at that point a second amnesty with still not making any progress on the border. The protests, I would say the biggest impact that the anti-immigration reform movement had was in 2007 when they shut down the phone lines in the U.S. Senate on the day that we were taking the vote on the floor to pass that package. Phone lines were just flooded, switchboards shut down. We had a couple of members that were on the fence, and I think it's fair to say that contributed to the fact that they ended up voting against the bill. If you're talking about the pro-immigration marches, there's an interesting political dynamic here that I think that the pro-immigration reform marches really bolstered and helped the Democrats, but frankly, they weren't super helpful for us to persuade our Republicans on the right that this is something that it's not that it turned them off of the idea, but it wasn't a counterbalance to what they were hearing from their primary voters back home. So I think we had a lot of people that were involved in this and a lot of people that were reinforcing where their bases were on this, but I don't know if either movement had an impact on trying to move the other side, if that makes sense.
No, that makes a ton of sense. I never thought that's why I wanted to ask you the question, because you were in that pinch point and you were getting it from both sides and you were trying to find that compromise. And, I remember that those days when like the phone lines would just light up and, we on our side just knew, okay, we can't match that.
Right. What's interesting is that and maybe this was naive, I always assumed that it was a small group of individuals at home that were making several phone calls in a day. But I think, looking at the 2016 election, I think maybe that's not the case. And I always thought that the portion of the population, or at least of the Republican Party, that felt that strongly about the immigration issue was actually a minority of the party. But after the 2016 election, I've really had to rethink that, because I think I was naive about that and maybe arrogant about that, because it's clearly something that a larger portion of our population is passionate about than I appreciated at the time.
Yeah. So going back to that day in 2007 when the bill goes down, you've had just this crazy 3-5 years of kind of falling into the issue and then playing this front row seat. Do you remember that day? I mean, what was going through your mind, and what did the senator say at that point in time?
Oh, yes, I do remember that day. And that was such a wild time. John McCain was obviously on the campaign trail through a lot of that debate, and John Kyle was really running it for the Republicans hand in hand with the Bush administration. I don't know if there's ever been another process where you have secretaries sitting at the table day after day in a closed room with Senate staff negotiating bills. I mean, it was crazy. It was wild. So we were going to the Senate floor. I don't know if you remember, but that was the time that the bill was like, it was on the floor, then it was off the floor, then it was on the floor, and there were votes at 2 a.m. and, et cetera, et cetera. So we were going to the floor, and every morning the members that were part of the quote unquote gang that had made this deal and were trying to protect it would meet in an office that was right off the Senate floor, the vice president's room, and they would kind of talk about what the issues of the day were and prepare for the debate. Our calculation was that we were 1 vote short. We were actually counting on Ensign, if you remember Ensign. He was our question mark. And as we were coming out of that meeting, we were told he was going to be a no. And so we knew that we were going into it with 59 votes. You need 60 for cloture to get off the Senate floor. But if you look at how that vote turned out, I think that we only ended up getting something like 46 votes, because you also aren't going to have members, if members know they're going to lose, they're not necessarily going to put their necks on the line to vote for something that's going to be a failing proposition if it's going to drive their base crazy. So I think that if you look at that vote, it looks more lopsided than I know that we were at that moment.
I didn't realize you were that close at that point.
We were really close. And then, there were odd things like Senator Brownback went to the floor and voted for it and then switched his vote to against it. That was weird. Trent Lott was a vote that we picked up that we didn't know why we did, and found out later that he was just so mad at the anti-immigrant members. He didn't want to be associated with them. And so he was just so mad at them, he decided to vote with us anyway. And he was retiring. So, but yeah, we were 1 vote short, which still, that's 59 votes in the U.S. Senate. I mean, it's not 60, but it is the majority of the U.S. Senate. But anyway, like I said, the vote doesn't reflect that. And then we went into the liaison's office that's on the other side of the Senate floor. And I just remember John Kyle telling us how sorry he was and that he felt like he had let everybody down because he wasn't able to deliver the votes from his party. And it was sad. And everybody was just sad. And then I went back to the office, and my boss had flown into town for the vote. And that's when he pulled me into his office and he said, "Becky, I know this is really disappointing, but we are on the side of right on this issue. I really believe that. And that to me means that one day we are going to succeed. So I know you're disappointed now, but we just need to prepare ourselves for the next opportunity."
And the next opportunity came, 6-7 years later in 2013. And you had changed roles again.
I had left the Senate and I was at the Bipartisan Policy Center standing up their immigration program. And I'd been there for just a few months. And when the Senate bill was dropped, and that December is when I went back to the House.
So before we get into your experiences on the Hill at that point, what was your take, as you're at the Bipartisan Policy Center and second term of Obama, this is early in that second term, why would Republicans say, okay, let's try to find a deal here?
Well, that's a good question. I will say that this is something that John McCain and Lindsey Graham and Marco Rubio really personally felt passionately about. I don't know if history will necessarily give all of those members credit for that, but it was something that they personally felt strongly about. But they also, not to be too clinical about it, they also saw where the future of this nation was going. And there was a feeling among some members of, if we look like we are anti-immigrant and potentially anti-Latinx and anti-Hispanic, the party in 20 years is going to disappear. And there needs to be a change in the narrative from the Republican Party around this issue. So I think Senator McCain's frustration was that this wasn't the issue that President Obama turned to in his first 100 days. I think there was a question whether or not it would be healthcare or immigration, and he decided to go with healthcare. So this was kind of the next opportunity. I mean, I think it was a mix of political pragmatism, but also feeling that it was the right thing to do, and this kind of older mentality around the compassionate conservative, and maybe don't have a ton of that probably left in Congress anymore, and the party evolves and it is what it is. But I think it was a combination of those things. I think there was definitely some, do we want to give this president another win from other parts of the party? But I think that it's something that they were willing to take that gamble on. I can tell you from Speaker Boehner's standpoint, he just knew it was the right thing to do. And I'm not saying that in a naive way, and that, I'm not saying that as political spin, but
tell me, when they reached out to you from the Speaker's office, why you went to the House to play the role that you did before you jump into that.
So when I left the Senate, I was just 100% burned out. I've been going pedal to the floor for 10 years at that point, and I was just ready to do something else. And I went to the Bipartisan Policy Center, like I said, and I was only there for 10 months, and I got a call from the Speaker's policy director saying they were looking to bring in someone. Basically, they didn't say this, but the implication was the Speaker's only going to be probably a Speaker for another year, and then he's going to step down, and he wants this to be his last big win, and we need somebody who can come on board to get it done. With the understanding that they recognize this is a huge lift and it's not just going to be a done deal, but that's the gamble that we want to take. I came in and I got a 2-cigarette interview with Speaker Boehner, which apparently means I made a good impression. And then, I'll be honest, when they first approached me about it, I laughed and I was like, that's a hard pass. Absolutely not. Are you crazy? I have no desire to do this. And then I called my husband and he said, well, maybe you should think for a second, because this could be a good opportunity for you. And so I had to call them back and tell them that I was rethinking. So.
Oh, really? You told him hard pass and you called back and he said, well, maybe not.
Yeah.
No,
I said, you're absolutely insane. There's not any chance in the world I would ever want to do this, but let me try to find somebody else for you. And then I called him back 2 hours later and said, well, maybe I was too harsh.
So, when did you think okay, this is something that Speaker Boehner really cares about, that this is important to him?
Oh, right out the gate. Yeah. He understood the issue. He asked me some really smart questions in my interview about, how I felt about things, what my thoughts were on the Senate bill. And, I'll be honest, I really underestimated the reaction to the Speaker hiring me.
Yeah,
and
that was wild.
It was crazy, but the Speaker knew it would be crazy. And so he took a huge gamble even hiring me to do that job. They put out a press release saying that they were hiring me along with 2 or 3 other staffers. They tried to kind of bury it in in a release that announced some other staff changes. And pretty quickly, there was a front page Washington Times article that was not super flattering, basically saying, John McCain's amnesty pusher has been hired by John Boehner. John Boehner is going to push for amnesty. That was quickly followed on by a lot of the right-wing publications. I hesitate to even call them right-wing, things like Breitbart, piling on and writing pretty aggressive stories about me and the work that I had done. And it turned into, I was getting harassing messages on Twitter. I was getting death threats on Twitter. I had to call my family and tell them not to answer their phones because the Breitbart reporters were being so aggressive. I, at one point, was worried that there were phone calls of mine that were being leaked to reporters and I didn't understand where that could have been coming from. It was just, I was nervous about walking from my car to my apartment because it got so aggressive. It was just a wild time. And again, I totally underestimated that. I really didn't think it would be that big of a deal or that people would really notice, but they did. Yeah. And, I could talk about this for a while, but it was just a really, really unfortunate situation, and I think was an interesting example of what we are seeing today some in how different media outlets are spinning the truth. I just was totally shocked.
So then what did the work look like in the House? Because you've got the Senate kind of doing their thing, but now your job is to wrangle the Republican conference to find a compromise.
Gosh, yeah. So House is an interesting beast. I had worked in the House, like I mentioned earlier, for a couple of years when I was younger, but I'd spent the vast majority of my career in the Senate. And then going back to the House, I loved working in the House. I loved the pace of it. I love the fact that the members are approachable and it's just a more casual experience. But I was also there in the time where the Republican Party in and of itself was having some pretty tough internal battles. So it was, the launch of the Freedom Caucus and this kind of anti-leadership movement. And again, we're still seeing this today, but that was kind of where it was kind of in its early stages at that point. So the idea was to go on the Republican retreat and to stress test this set of principles that the speaker was going to put forward to get immigration reform done. And it was a one-page document that kind of, at a very high level, summarized where he intended to go, including a legalization program. So that was kind of out the gate. I came on board very early December, and then the retreat was end of January. So this is still pretty early. Of course, the document leaked to the press, which wasn't super helpful, but for lack of a better phrase, kind of anti-immigration reform movement really kind of stacked that conversation and came in pretty hot into that conversation and really kind of dominated that conversation. So leaving the retreat, I think I was still somewhat hopeful because the conversation had gone, frankly, a little bit better than I thought it was going to go. But I think others were pretty discouraged. And so the question was, where do we go from here? And it was clear that I was not going to be in a position to hold a pen to write an immigration reform bill. Again, because of all of this noise around me and being in, pro-amnesty and my hire. And the question was, what role could I play if other members were interested in having that work done? Because there are so few Republican immigration staffers just on the Hill, period. So Speaker Ryan and Mario Diaz-Balart started working on their own proposal. They'd been part of this kind of gang of whatever that the House had been working with for a while before I came on board.
And this is when Paul Ryan was chair of Ways and Means, right?
Yes, now a former speaker, but at the time, yes, was chairman of Ways and Means. And they got really close. They had a solid proposal. They started shopping it to members, doing like an unofficial whip count, as they call it, so counting votes. And they thought they could get maybe even 150 Republican members to support something on the floor. So the idea was that the bill would be taken to the floor in a series of pieces, and that it would allow members to vote for the pieces that they liked and would allow them to vote against pieces that they didn't like. Obviously, the hardest piece on this would be the legalization piece. But they did think that 150 vote point, they thought that they could get to that on the legalization piece, which is pretty wild. And I don't know if that was, overly ambitious, but, the goal at the time always was to bring a bill to the floor that could get the majority of Republicans to support it. So not to get to 219 and pass the House on Republican-only votes, but to get the majority of the party.
That was the Hastert rule, right?
Right, exactly.
All right, then the two things happened very quickly.
So Eric Cantor lost his primary, hugely unexpected and shocking to everybody. And people thought that it was largely due to the implication that he was supportive of a version of the DREAM Act. He had floated a version of the DREAM Act, but what was interesting was that he was far from a person that was at the front of the immigration debate. He had just said that he would be open to the idea of talking about doing something for the Dreamers, now for the DACA recipients. And conservative radio, Laura Ingraham specifically, really flooded his district with anti-Cantor ads. And there's also this kind of mood in the party at that time where it was starting to turn, anti-leadership, anti-establishment. He was obviously the number 2 Republican in the House, so that probably didn't help with that narrative. And at the same time, we were suddenly seeing undocumented children and teenagers arriving at the southern border, and in record numbers, like nothing we'd ever seen before.
This is the first wave of unaccompanied minors, summer 2014.
So, Eric Cantor lost in June, and then we start in June and July, we're seeing these waves of the first wave of the unaccompanied minors. And so it played into this narrative. Both of those things were like a 1-2 punch to kind of make people more nervous about taking the gamble of doing immigration reform. And that's really when I knew that we were in trouble and that we were probably not going to get there. I think maybe other people knew it before me, and maybe I was just holding out hope. But those few weeks, I would say, were pretty rough.
So you've been working on this issue since 2003. You've gone through a number of different very, very key roles. You now have a little bit of distance from it. What you've seen, what you've learned, what you've experienced, what should we take from those experiences to apply moving forward?
I think a couple of things. I think that there are a lot more people out there that are trying to do the right thing and want to do the right thing than we are necessarily exposed to or presented to on a daily basis. I met some of the greatest, most patriotic, hardest working people in my life doing this work, and I will always be grateful for that. And just because we didn't succeed doesn't mean that we didn't accomplish some things that we should be proud of. And I also think about, we're coming up on 20 years Coming up on 20 years of President Bush and President Fox standing together and announcing their effort to start working on immigration reform. But that's also how long it took to get healthcare reform done. And hard and complicated things take time. And unfortunately, we've lost some of our best champions along the way. But just because it has taken a long time doesn't mean it's not the right thing to do, and doesn't mean that it can't be done. And, I go back to what John McCain told me, which is we were trying to do the right thing, and eventually right will win out, and just to keep working at it.
What do you think John McCain would say, like 2 points of advice be?
I think, and this is specific advice for members of Congress or congressional staff or however you want to say it, but to find a group of people that you can trust and that you respect and that you share values with, and that doesn't necessarily mean values as in your party values, but fundamental principled values, and to work hard with them towards a common goal. But you have to build that trusted relationship, because this is such a hard and complicated issue to work on, that trust factor is so important. And I think that he would just say, just to keep at it, just keep working. He was, I still think, probably the hardest working member of the U.S. Senate, at least that I encountered while I was up there. And he never saw a fight that wasn't worth fighting, and a fight that he thought was too hard or insurmountable. And he always believed that if, you just kept at it and kept at it and kept at it, eventually you would be able to get there. And I think he'd still believe that. I think he would be kind of going crazy with the current political environment that we're in, but
who isn't, right?
Yeah, but I think that he, still believed in the goodness of a lot of the members of the U.S. Senate and the members of Congress that are up there, and I think that he would still be trying to find his next gang of whatever to put together the next package.
Because I was going to ask you a question, kind of what were the similarities between 2004 to 2007, and kind of the more recent iteration of the 13 and 14. It's that kind of finding a group of members who share a value set around immigration. And you talked about the Republicans in the Gang of Eight in 2013 and 14, them probably never getting the credit that they deserve of actually really caring about this issue.
Yeah.
And that's, I think we just overlook how important that is.
I think that it's really easy in this debate to identify angels and demons and to blame, one party or the other. But this issue is divisive within both parties, to be frank. And on the left, you kind of have this is oversimplifying it, but kind of a pro-immigrant movement, and then the labor unions who don't always align on how to do this. On the right, you have kind of the more pro-business, for lack of a better phrase, like Reagan Republicans, big tent party, and you have the secure border crowd. And because it is divisive within both parties, sometimes that means that you can find interesting allies. It's that whole idea of, the politics is not a plane, but it's actually a circle, and the ends meet, sometimes the extremes of both meet in the middle. We saw that a lot during this debate. Unfortunately, sometimes that made an alliance that would try to pull apart a part of a bill that was important to us, but it also allowed for those middle pieces to come together in a way that could be very productive. But I know that that's a hard story to tell people. So I would say that I don't think that those members get enough credit, yes, for passionately caring about it, but also in a lot of cases, really putting their careers on the line. Jeff Flake went out on this issue. He got kicked off the House Judiciary Committee by leadership. You could argue that this played into the reason that he decided not to run again in Arizona. I mean, Jim Colby, oh man, I went to some town halls with him after they introduced the Colby-Flake-McCain bill. And there were some scary times. And there was a time where he really didn't think he was going to get through his next primary in Arizona. So they were taking big risks. And the only reason they would do that ultimately is because they really did personally care about the issue.
Yeah. Hey, Becky, thank you so much. We covered a lot of territory, and I feel like we didn't even begin to uncover everything we wanted to. So I got one more question for you. So the name of the podcast is Only in America. So the question is, just to finish this sentence, only in America, ...
Only in America are we able to have these incredible debates around complicated issues in a free and open way. And while that often seems to result in some pretty heated arguments and exchanges, it's at the crux of what makes our government and our democracy great. And I would also say that only in America could a 22-year-old daughter of an Air Force pilot and a teacher be lucky enough to work with some of the greatest legislators of our time on some of the coolest issues and most important issues in the country.
Hey, thank you, Becky. I really, really appreciate this. Thank you. Becky Tallent is head of U.S. government relations at Dropbox and vice chair of the National Immigration Forum Board of Directors. You can find more information about Becky at our website, immigrationforum.org/podcast. And tune in next week to hear about the consequences of the way our immigration system is lacking from the perspective of one family who sought asylum, and the lessons the movement should apply moving forward. And if you haven't yet, be sure to take a listen to our past few episodes on our legal immigration system and how we ended up where we are today. If you like what you hear, subscribe to Only in America on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'd love to hear your feedback, so please leave us a review on your favorite platform. Only in America is produced and edited by Joanna Taylor, Megan Wetmore, and Becca Wall. Our artwork and graphics are designed by Carla Leha. I'm Ali Nirani, and I will talk to you next week.